Howdy, Fire Emblem gamers! So when Fire Emblem Three Hopes was first announced, I initially wrote it off pretty hard, as did many people watching that Nintendo Direct at the time, judging by the initial internet reactions. Granted, the greater Nintendo fan community doesn't tend to respond too favorably to Fire Emblem taking up real estate in general Nintendo announcements, but even among the Fire Emblem fans, we were all clamoring for the long overdue reveal of a new game or a new remake. And when the next entry in the Fire Emblem series would be another entry in the Warriors spin-off series, after the first game garnered a not terrible but still lukewarm reception, it definitely raised some skepticism. After all, while those Musou games do manage to cram in a lot of series fan service, a button-mashy action game is a pretty far cry from the geek-brain tactical gameplay fix that Fire Emblem provides. Now, that was just the initial reaction. I think the gameplay demo that came out a bit later did a lot to really recapture some of the interest in Three Hopes. Seeing Byleth, the main character that we've all come to know and love from Three Houses proper, suddenly being presented as an antagonist with Shez, the new player character, being on the receiving end of a monumental burn and beatdown, it really did a lot to create intrigue in the game. Three Hopes gives us a mostly familiar setting at first, although with the new main character playing a more passive role as another student, rather than the more active role that Byleth plays in the lives of her students and peers. While Shez does have some level of mystery and protagonist plot device power, it's largely inconsequential for most of the game, really driving in the what-if factor of the Three Houses storyline, without Byleth being an active player. Thanks to Arvel awakening in this timeline, Shez is the one who unites with the three main house lords in the prologue, rather than Byleth, and thus is brought to the monastery, this time as a student. This creates kind of a domino effect in how the plot plays out, but to give the condensed version as I understand it, Costas, the bandit leader, is killed rather than being given the chance to flee to the canyon, causing his remaining bandits to escape into the fortress hideout. Iritsa is assigned the role of professor as per Edelgard's intended plan. Iritsa being a much more violent person than Byleth, as students under his charge hunt down and rout the remaining bandits, leading them to discover Monica, who is locked in the fortress. Monica is freed and is able to expose Solon and those who slither in the dark, allowing the Church and the Empire to root them out earlier, disrupting their plans. As a result of the turmoil, Rhea sends the students of the Academy home to their respective territories, depriving them of the full year of school life, and that's where the root split of Three Hopes really begins. Now, due to the wildly different circumstances of how the Academy arc plays out in Three Hopes, naturally this has a profound effect on how the character development differs for the students going into the time skip, even with the much shorter gap of 2 years rather than 5 from Three Houses. Of course, this is most clearly visible with the three House Lords, given that they get the most screen time and plot relevance out of all the characters in the game. The one I'm most interested in, however, is Claude. I've always been Team Golden Deer from the beginning. When I first bought Three Houses, I picked Golden Deer, finished the route after 50 or so hours of gameplay, and thought, yes, that was a good game that I am now finished with. And I did it again with Three Hopes and Golden Wildfire. While I did go back eventually to brush up on the other routes, Golden Deer has always been my favorite, with my favorite characters, favorite house leader, and favorite story premise. Anyways, with that all being said, it's time to get to the main point of this discussion. How Claude's portrayal in Three Hopes differs from that of his appearance in Three Houses. This is a loaded topic, to put it delicately, with strong opinions on both sides, ranging from the opinion that his character was completely ruined, to others saying that he's been made a much more interesting and multidimensional character. It goes without saying that, for better or worse, the character did indeed undergo a pretty significant tonal shift in how he was written. Three Houses mostly presents him as a pretty easygoing and friendly guy. He casually refers to you as Teach, and later as my friend, and even gives a pretty awesome power of friendship speech in the climax of the game. something that sounds like it would be a bit more fitting in Persona rather than Fire Emblem. But besides that, he's also a pretty savvy guy, determined in his goals, but not to where it consumes him like it might be said for Edelgard. So his initial appearance is a pretty charismatic dude, definitely a likable character, but where some might have argued that he falls flat is that he was made to be a little too sanitized. From the beginning he was presented as the schemer, but while he does get to exhibit some tactical prowess in his route, that facet of his character is debatably somewhat underexplored. This really was a little disappointing for some players, since initial impressions certainly did play up the whole devious schemer angle. Isla's infamous first impression lines when meeting the house leaders for the first time mention Claude's smile not reaching his eyes, hinting at some sort of darkness brewing behind his easygoing outward appearance. Earlier than that, however, Fire Emblem Heroes actually featured Claude along with Edelgard, Dimitri, and Byleth in a Forging Bonds event, an in-game event that allows you to raise friendship levels with 4 featured characters to unlock rewards and special conversations. This released a few days before the official launch of Three Houses, giving players of the mobile game a little sneak preview taste of the main characters. Claude's Bond conversation notably involved him using poisonous mushrooms in order to execute a scheme to weaken his enemies through poisoning their food. This point about his interest in poisons ended up being used again for his support conversations in Three Houses, but it's easy to see how people who played the Forging Bonds event initially could have gotten a much more extreme first impression of Claude's character. So the fact that Three Houses did not really explore this more sinister side of Claude was a little bit of a letdown. His secret ended up being more about his Elmyran heritage, and while it's easy to see how that could be somewhat of a taboo issue, given the supposedly xenophobic nature of Fodlan, which also isn't explored too heavily in any great detail other than some scuffles with Elmyra along the border, doesn't actually impact Claude or any of the other characters in his route too heavily in any meaningful or tangible way. The good folks down at Intelligence Systems, or maybe it was Koei Tecmo, must have heard these criticisms and made sure to course correct for Three Hopes, and arguably to an excessive degree. To put it vaguely, Claude has become a lot more morally gray, and the fan reception to this change has been, well, mixed. For starters, any time official canon messes with an established character, especially one that fans have such a strong connection to, there's a very real risk of pushback, as those fans might be alienated when the characteristics they like so much are potentially changed or removed. Modern Fire Emblem is very much a character-driven game, with many players developing strong connections to the characters, especially the Three Houses Lords. It's my belief that Three Hopes falls into somewhat of a strange gray area where obviously the circumstances and the course the story takes are very different from Three Houses proper, but at the same time the setting is not far enough removed to where the characters can be seen as completely different. It's not really a case of Timeline A Claude and Timeline B Claude, but rather just Claude, the same character in a different story, if that makes sense. On the other hand, if this kind of characterization shift is done well, it can provide whole new dimensions to the character in question. Which does beg the question, do the changes to Claude's writing in Fire Emblem Three Hopes make sense? And going past that, are they effective changes? Right off the bat, the biggest catalyst for change is that the students of Garrigmach Monastery did not get the full year of school life. This isn't even just an anime thing. Most people, even in the real world, can attest that the time you spend in school is very formative, not just from what you learn, but also the time you spend with others developing social skills and such, even if it is all compulsory. Equally as impactful is the absence of Byleth, who I suppose has the amazing anime protagonist plot power of being able to profoundly touch the lives of all around her with seldom a word. Seriously, this is kinda off topic, but once again I feel the need to go on a bit of a mini rant of how making Byleth a pseudo-silent protagonist just didn't really work, and making a stoic character that doesn't talk much but still gets voiced scenes like in Three Hopes made for a much more compelling character. Well, that point about Byleth has been discussed to death already, but I just felt like I had to express my appreciation for what they did with the character in this game. Either way, Shez being another companion and classmate just did not have the same level of influence, being somewhat of a passive force with some battle skills and not too much else. So going back to Claude, he doesn't get his power of friendship buff at the school, and is sent back to the Alliance territory and forced to deal with real-world conflict much sooner. And there also was the scene with his brother, Shahid, but I do feel like this entire plot arc was a little half-baked. Shahid was so comically, mustache-twirlingly antagonistic that it felt a little hard to take him seriously at times. That's not necessarily a bad thing for a villain character per se, but trying to tie it to Claude's character development felt a little bit out of place, especially with how quickly the whole thing started and resolved, like it was a mere footnote to pad out the story. I definitely can see what they were going for, mostly trying to flesh out the Elmira region and the Alliance territory a bit, since the Golden Deer route was pretty light on world building compared to the other routes, as well as using the conflict with his brother as a catalyst for Claude's more jaded and pragmatic approach to life, but I can't help but feel the mark was a little off here. The brevity of the scenes made it hard to fit in any emotional impact when Claude had to fight Shahid, especially since it was literally right in the middle of a more pressing affair, namely the conflict with the Empire. And to go back to what I mentioned earlier, Shahid has big generic bandit chapter boss energy. It's probably gotta be how they drew his face. I could easily see him coming to Fire Emblem Heroes as a low-res, low-speed, flying axe unit with no preferred weapon. So how do these changes in the story beats affect Claude's character arc? Well, naturally, they lead much more heavily into Claude taking up a leadership role within the army. Claude is the main shot caller now and a much more active participant in the events taking place in Fodlan as a whole, with the rest of his army, Shez included, mostly just along for the ride. This lends itself to all sorts of scenarios where he is actually able to flex his tactical abilities for better or worse. Most notably, he is much more aggressive and pragmatic in trying to achieve his goals. This is furthered by how in Three Hopes it does feel like your faction has more power from the get-go, likely aided by the nature of the Musuo game wanting to make the player feel like a badass at all times. In Three Houses, the Golden Deer felt like it had a bit of the underdog effect among the major players in the war. Drastic measures felt like they were done to grasp at survival against the inexorable march of the Empire. In Three Hopes, however, the Alliance is definitely not on the same level as the Empire or Kingdom for most of the game, but it does feel like they're in a better position and Claude has more attempts to make moves to further his personal agenda. Perhaps the most infamous scene to highlight this shift is the battle against Catherine, and Claude uses his newfound allies from the Empire as live bait to keep Catherine and her forces distracted, while his team captures the surrounding fortresses, creating a trap, ensuring a victory with no casualties on his side. This results in both of the Empire and the Kingdom forces being wiped out almost in their entirety, and it's somewhat shockingly dark how the scene keeps flashing back to the Empire commander Randolph futilely attempting to hold in the middle of the map versus Catherine, under the impression until the bitter end that the Alliance forces would come to bail him out. It's almost like this darker turn for Claude's character was being explicitly lampshaded by the story with how heavily he's reprimanded by Judith and even Shez, who up until that point had been a bit of a yes man, and even further reinforced that it was the wrong thing to do despite it being an objective total victory, by it directly leading to the events with Fleisch seeking revenge for her brother's demise. This is the most jarring example of Claude living up to his reputation as a schemer and not just a sorta clever tactician, especially since even his own army is included into what's going on the entire time he's carrying out his plan, with the rest of the Golden Deer members commenting on how they're eager to rush in to aid the Empire. It likely is this level of pragmatism on display here that people take issue with. Now that's not necessarily a thing that's exclusive to Three Hopes per se, but it is much more explicit. In the Azure Moon and Crimson Flower routes of Three Houses, where, again, Violet is not present as the teacher for the Golden Deer class, Claude is all too willing to abandon Fodlan to its fate once he realizes he doesn't have a place there anymore. Of course, we don't really get a look into what's going on behind the scenes in the Alliance in those routes, but it does show that he was more willing to make hard sacrifices in pursuit of zone goals, in that case being the Alliance territory as he abandons it to head to Elmira, likely attempting to rise in power there instead. So to boil it down, Golden Wildfire gives us a glimpse into the what-if scenario of Golden Deer without Byleth. People have likened Claude to Edelgard 2.0 in Three Hopes, in that he's a bit more ruthless in pursuing his ambitions, and while I can understand the sentiment, it's definitely a bit reductive. Claude is still a bit more mellowed out and willing to negotiate or solve things peacefully, even with Edelgard also being a bit more mellow in Three Hopes, likely as a side effect of not having the slithers acting as a constant thorn in her side. The big difference lies within their motivations. Edelgard is very much driven by her personal connection to Fodlan and personal vendetta against the Church. She's much more connected to the overarching lore of Fodlan, and being that her goal is to uproot society as a whole, her motivations lean very morally gray at best. She also gets the side benefit of being able to shirk a lot of her nefariousness onto Hubert, a little perk that Claude doesn't quite have the privilege of doing. Claude, on the other hand, is driven by more nebulous goals. Being an outsider, his route takes on a much more objective perspective, seeing things more for what they are. While he is strongly motivated by his ambitions within Fodlan, his goals are arguably more noble, albeit more loosely defined, wanting to break the barriers and destroy racism, as they say. This, combined with the aforementioned underdog effect, paints him as a much more standard JRPG good guy. These base character traits haven't changed much from Three Houses to Three Hopes. Claude is still driven by the same motivations. However, he has a bit more nuance baked into his writing now, which gives more depth to him when he was not necessarily needing it, but it doesn't hurt either, since he definitely was the least developed of the three main house leaders. A what-if scenario doesn't take away from the original game, and it's just as well since Three Hopes was intended to supplement rather than replace or overshadow Three Houses. But on the other hand, if one simply just dislikes the writing in Three Hopes for what it is, that's also valid. You can understand something and still not like it, and as much as I'm a fan of Three Hopes Golden Wildfire for most of the route, I can definitely see that they overcompensated on making Claude not come off as a goody two-shoes in certain areas, creating some scenes that would feel questionable, out of character, or just plain disagreeable. And I put emphasis on most because the ending for Golden Wildfire was absolutely abysmal, to the point where it feels really unfinished, to be honest. It's almost comical how abruptly it ends, with Claude just accepting that Rhea is the Immaculate One and is immediately okay with killing her. At least in Verdant Wind, with Nemesis coming basically out of nowhere, it was still a satisfying final boss because of how epic it was. Sure, it didn't tie into Claude's route super well, but there were some roots, like his interest in the mythos of Fodlan. At the very least, it was unique, and it felt like a fitting golden ending, even if there wasn't really meant to be one in that game. Three Hopes endings were just kinda not great. Azure Moon and Scarlet Blaze got a little bit of a better deal, what else is new, but not by too much. I was thinking of mentioning the little footnote where Claude betrays Edelgard and Scarlet Blaze to uncharacteristically draw out the war, but it's just part of the bad ending, although the whole thing is a bad ending if you know what I'm saying, where you kill Byleth and Geralt, so it's hard to say just how canon it is. Or it's possible they just wanted to pile on more shame onto the player for not reading a guide to get through the cryptic steps to recruit them. But Golden Wildfire just felt like the quality took a nosedive in the last chapter or two, admittedly speaking as a huge Rhea sympathizer. I know Koei Tecmo didn't want to overshadow Three Houses proper with Three Hopes, whatever that means, but I suppose if they made the ending too good it might have had that effect, possibly. Nothing really gets resolved, although I suppose we were supposed to extrapolate with Rhea out of the picture. The Kingdom, Alliance, and the Empire were able to put aside their differences, and Claude began working on his long-term goal of defeating racism from his newfound power within peace times. That is a massive assumption they're asking us to make, and if they're going to do that, they could have at least made the final boss against Nemesis again. Not having a Warriors remix of God-Shattering Star was probably the biggest letdown of the entire game, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're saving that for some sort of DLC expansion later down the line. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but the ending really did leave me wanting more. I do think a proper payoff for Claude's character arc in Three Hopes could have gone a long way, although it's hard to say that if the people claiming character assassination would even play that far in. Jokes aside, however, once he got over his initial edginess in the early Three Hopes War phase, he really was starting to come into his own as an interesting take on the character. This was demonstrated pretty well in the Arvel Pocket Dimension scene, where we're treated to some nice one-on-one conversations between the house leaders, in a rare setting where they're not at each other's throats, which was content that we were sorely deprived of, mind you. So in conclusion, do I think Claude was ruined in Three Hopes? No, I wouldn't describe it as ruined, or character assassination, or any of those dramatic terms. I honestly think they did a decent job at taking a well-established character and inserting him into a completely different timeline, where he had to develop and adapt to the different setting while still being recognizable as the same character. Of course, there were some stumbling and hiccups along the way, but to be honest, I really didn't expect much from Three Hopes at all going in. So the fact that we got some effort put into writing Claude rather than 40 hours of Shez OC fanfiction is something that I can respect, even if it is ultimately controversial. To me at least, it's certainly preferable trying to change things up a bit than playing it safe and getting another game like the original Fire Emblem Warriors where nothing really happens despite the massive cast of characters to pull from. That's just my take on it though. So leave a comment telling me what you feel about the character changes and writing shifts in Fire Emblem Three Hopes. And thank you for watching. See you again in the next discussion video.